Where is the line when it comes to the right of a family life? So let's discuss that with Dr Rakib Ehsan. He's a political commentator and joins us live here on Drive. Evening to you.
Evening, Cristo. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us this evening. So I think a lot of people will find this very, very difficult to get their head around, because I think most reasonable people understand that there is a right to a family life. In a civilised country like the United Kingdom, you have the right to a family life. But what's your reaction to someone who has committed a crime as serious as this being able to have their family life mean that they cannot be deported?
Well, Cristo, I have to make the point that with rights also comes responsibility. And we're talking about someone here who is a serious crime boss, dealing in drugs. What about the families which have suffered as a result of his activities? You also mentioned there that this individual reportedly indulged in an extramarital affair. So again, that comes to my point that with these rights also comes responsibility. And I think that what the real problem that we have here is that all too often we have these cases where the individual rights of very serious criminals are prioritised over the protection of law-abiding Britons. And I think that's a serious problem with our human rights framework. But there's also an issue here in terms of our border security system and our deportations regime. I believe that this particular individual, his background, he's an Alevi Kurd, and it's been claimed that if he was to return to Turkey, he may well suffer persecution. But an immigration tribunal heard that he had returned to his homeland at 8 separate occasions without facing any serious form of persecution. So I think what we have here, we have a dysfunctional asylum system, and we also have a human rights framework which doesn't prioritise the safety and security of the law-abiding British public.
Are there any crimes that could be committed that you think that a family life could be kept in the UK? I'm just wondering whether this is... Is there a line here where if it's a low-level crime, I mean, all crime is wrong, and if you've come to the UK, you should abide by the UK laws. I don't think anyone disagrees with that, but also we don't live in a perfect world. Are there any crimes that you think actually there is a line where it's more serious crimes where you should be deported, or should you be deported if you commit any crime here in the UK if you weren't born here?
Well, I think that the severity of the crime certainly comes into it. We're talking here about as a high-level crime boss, and I think that especially when you're so involved in the distribution of drugs, I think that we're talking about a dangerous individual here, and their presence in the UK is certainly not conducive to the public good. Of course, we can have a conversation in terms of what should the repercussions be, what should the consequences be if they're sort of lower order crimes, if you could call it that. But I think that the real issue here is that there's far too many cases where we have serious criminals who have been responsible for very serious criminal activities who have been allowed to remain in the UK. And I think that would be your starting point, the removal of those dangerous foreign criminals from Britain and being returned to their country of origin.
We also have a big problem here in the UK of even when the deportation has taken place, because I don't know if you saw there was another story today about an illegal immigrant from Lithuania. This is Audrijas Verkauskas, and he was first removed from the UK in November 2015. He had been deported 5 times and was once again found living in the UK. Police arrested him for unrelated matters in April in Peterborough and then discovered he was in breach of his deportation. So he's now going to be deported for a 6th time once he served his sentence. So we have this bizarre situation where deportations aren't happening, and when they are, people are just coming back.
Well, it doesn't sound like a very effective deportations regime. It sounds like a revolving doors border security system. And I think that's the point, that if you have a national border system which is as porous as ours, to the point that you have people entering in very high numbers, illegally entering in high numbers, who are undocumented migrants, ultimately unchecked, then you are going to have these cases where you may well deport an individual on more than one occasion. So I think that really shows that we need to have a border security system which really, in my opinion, really improves in terms of really keeping a log of all of this. And having a register, you should have a deportations register, really, to avoid the possibility that individuals, foreign criminals that you deport, they may look to re-enter the UK. And I think that the fact that you have these kind of cases where people have re-entered the UK after being deported as a result of their criminal activities in the UK, that will certainly be a deep concern for much of the British public.
I genuinely believe you have a contract when you go to another country. I really do. And also that contract goes both ways. And that's one of the big problems we have with immigration in general, I think, in this country, is that, so if I were to move to Australia, for instance, something I've been tempted to do years ago, it would be my obligation to be as Australian as possible, I think, whilst keeping whatever heritage I want to. But I think it's my obligation to love Australia and to want to be Australian and sort of take part in Australian culture and pay my taxes there and build my life there and contribute in both a positive cultural and financial way, right? And not commit crimes. That's, you know, sort of fundamental. And I think that it's on the obligation of the Australian government to say, right, we'll accept you, we'll say yes to you coming, but it's our obligation to protect you, to make sure that, you know, you have a decent police system, that you have a decent working, health system, and that you have access to education for any of your children. And if we can't fulfil that for you, then we're not going to let you in. And if you can't fulfil what I've just described, then you also shouldn't come over there. And I think that that is the fundamental problem that we're facing here in the UK, is that we have people who have genuinely come here, who are decent people who want to work, but we don't have the infrastructure to support them, so we probably shouldn't have let them in the first place. Or we have those people who come here who have no intention of being British when it comes to laws, when it comes to abiding by our values and all of those sorts of things. And it's just got completely and utterly messed up. That contract is null and void, right?
No, absolutely. I think that when it comes to our immigration system, we need both quantity and quality control. What I mean by that is newcomers, they should have the education, the skills. English language proficiency is hugely important, which would allow them to integrate. And I think they also want to look at cultural suitability with that, in terms of how willing are they to integrate in a civic sense, in terms of being part of their new society and contributing to it in a social, economic and cultural sense. But we also have to look at our capacity to integrate newcomers. That's very important as well, especially in terms of social infrastructure. So I think that what you talk about there being a contract based on reciprocity, I think that's hugely important. We also need an asylum system which prioritises those who are at the most risk of violence and persecution in their homelands. In my view, there are far too many illegal migrants which are ultimately undercutting genuine refugees. So I think that that's the way we should approach immigration and refugee policy moving forward.
It's so frustrating. And I'm going to tell you a story about something in just a second before we must move on. But it's so frustrating to me because also they are hand in hand. And what people in successive governments don't seem to have realised is that if you don't have the infrastructure and you don't have the actual capacity, that was the word you used, then actually that then makes cultural tensions as well.
Absolutely.
Because then people will say, well, hang on, why are other people of different cultures seemingly getting ahead of the queue? And that is then going to cause those sorts of tensions, which perhaps wouldn't have been there had the capacity been there in the first place. Now, that's down to the state. That's down to the people in charge. It's so frustrating. And one of those other stories, just to flag this one for you as well today, which really reflects what we've been talking about with that contract, is that Britain has now become the Western capital for Sharia courts. Apparently, according to the Times, polygamy is so normalised within certain factions of the Islamic community that an app for Muslims in England and Wales and you can create an Islamic will on this app, has a drop-down menu for men to say how many wives they have. You can choose between 1 and 4. And also, you can give daughters half as much inheritance as sons. And you can also end your marriage by saying the word divorce 3 times. There are now 85 Sharia courts, they're called Sharia councils, operating in the UK since 1982. And a lot of people coming from Islamic countries to the United Kingdom are turning to those courts, which operate as informal bodies, issuing those sorts of rulings rather than the British courts, rather than the official court system. This is exactly what we're talking about, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I think I think you're referring to the Islamic Sharia Council for Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which was established in 1982 in Leighton. So this is actually not very new. The existence of Sharia courts in the UK. I think that the issue here is we're a country, we have a rich tradition of considerable religious freedoms, but I do think there needs to be a reassertion of state sovereignty. Polygamous marriages, they are outlawed in the UK. Indeed, you can be found guilty of the crime of bigamy in line with the Section 11 of the Matrimonial Causes Act, which was passed in 1973. I believe, all the way back then. So I think what we need to see here is having the existence of religious minority courts. I'm personally a social conservative. I'm not against their existence in principle, but that depends on the strict principle of considering the law of the land to be paramount. That holds the key. So I think that there's no place for polygamous marriages in the UK. And on top of that, if you talk about Muslim communities, you have a nikah, which is the Islamic marriage, which is it's Islamic marital contract. You could describe it that way. But alongside that, there has to be legally recognised marriages in the eyes of British law. And I think that's very important because with those legally recognised marriages, they provide much needed protections, supports and rights as well. And I think that the point you made there about this drop-down menu on an app that creates Islamic wills, you can choose between 1 and 4. There's also Islamic matrimonial apps where male users, they're asked to state their polygamy plan, whether they'd like to just stick with one wife or will they seek a second wife. So that tells you there is a normalization of polygamy within, especially in my opinion, more segregated elements of the British Muslim population. So I think as a social conservative, I'm not against the existence of religious minority courts. You have Sharia courts, you also have Beth Dins, which are essentially Jewish courts. So I'm not against their existence, but there has to be, ultimately, there has to be respect for the law of the land.
And a limit and parameters in which they can operate. Really appreciate that. Listen, Dr Rakib Ehsan, political commentator, thanks for taking the time to give your views on all of that.